The material realm exists for the living entity to pretend for some time that he is a creator, controller, and enjoyer. To fulfill this delusion, the living entity has to work very hard to earn his status. He does not become the creator, controller, and enjoyer just by wishing it. Rather, he is required to make sacrifices to acquire the status of a creator, controller, and enjoyer. The Absolute Truth did not have to earn his status as a creator, controller, and enjoyer, but the living entity has to earn his status. Whatever the living entity earns is temporary. It is spent, lost, and destroyed. Due to continuous destruction of the previously created things, it is not possible to create just once and enjoy forever. One has to constantly keep creating in order to continue enjoying. Thus, a schism is created between creating, controlling, and enjoying. If we are creating new things, then we are not enjoying existing things. Those things that we created in the past are being destroyed while we are busy creating new things. Then, if we start enjoying the previously created things, then those things are destroyed even faster while we are not creating new things. If we become busy maintaining existing things, then we are not creating new things and not enjoying existing things. Thus, it is impossible to be creator, controller, and enjoyer simultaneously. Due to the continuous destruction of what has been created previously, the living entity suffers from great fear and anxiety. He is always afraid that his creations are futile. If he enjoys, then they will be lost quickly. If he doesn't enjoy them, they will still be lost, and he would have worked in vain. The main cause of fear and anxiety is time, which continuously destroys the living entity's creations. The living entity gets exhausted by the process of continuous creation for short term enjoyment. He lives in the fear of losing everything that he has previously created. This fear makes the living entity feel helpless, inadequate, and incapable of fighting the inexorable onslaught of time. He wanted to be like the Absolute Truth, but he is diminished to nothing by time. This feeling of nothingness is called Maya. The living entity is actually small, but small is not nothing. Small is also not supreme. In trying to become supreme, the small becomes nothing. Thus, the material world is described as the interplay of three agencies: 1. Time that destroys everything; 2. Maya or the feeling of nothingness; and 3. The small living entity trying to become supreme. Big Bang cosmologists say that the world came out of nothing. Buddhists also say that the world came out of nothing and returns to nothing. But in Vedic texts, the material world comes out of the feeling of nothingness. The living entity feeling that nothingness is not nothing. The time that destroys everything is also not nothing. Even that feeling of nothingness is imposed on the living entity by Maya, which is also not nothing. Therefore, the world did not come from nothing. However, it comes from the feeling of nothingness. The difference is subtle but very important. We can look at a great person and be inspired to love them and serve them. This is the ideal state. But sometimes we can look at a great person and realize that we will never be like them. We feel disappointed and decide to not look at the great person to avoid the feeling of personal inadequacy. Thereby, we withdraw into our shell. This is not ideal, but it is possible. Then we can look at a great person and become envious of their status. We decide to become like them and displace them from their status. This is impossible when that great person is the absolute truth. When a small person accepts his small status humbly, then the presence of a great person has a rejuvenating, inspiring, and accelerating effect on the small person. This is called the internal energy. Under its influence, the small person is excited and happy to serve the great person. When a small person accepts that he is small but is not comfortable with it, then the presence of a great person has a disappointing, withdrawing, and isolating effect on the small person. This is called the marginal energy. The small person withdraws from the great person and becomes self absorbed. Finally, when a small person is unable to accept that he is small, then the presence of a great person has an envious, rebellious, and infuriating effect on the small person. This is called external energy. The small person is infuriated by the fact that he is not great and decides to prove his superiority to everyone by establishing his greatness and displacing the great person. The material energy is therefore divided into three stages. The first stage is a person feeling inferior. The second stage is a person feeling infuriated by his perceived humiliation and deciding to prove his superiority. The third stage is a struggle to establish his superiority, which always fails and then takes him back to the feeling of inferiority. From this inferiority again springs another angry state to establish superiority, which then leads to a new struggle to establish superiority, which again fails to establish superiority, putting him back to the feeling of inferiority. This tripartite division of matter is called Maya, Shakti, and Prakriti. Maya is the feeling of inferiority, Shakti is the feeling of superiority, and Prakriti is the failed struggle to establish superiority. The Shakti, Prakriti, and Maya description can also be understood through the Satchidanand triad. The deep rooted feeling of inferiority is the unhappiness in the person called Maya. From this inferiority springs anger, which is the power to gain mastery and is called Shakti. From this Shakti ensues the struggle for existence, trying to establish one's superiority, and is called Prakriti. Shakti is discussed extensively in the Shakta texts, Prakriti is discussed extensively in the Vaishnava texts, and Maya is discussed extensively in the Shaiva texts. The subject matter is so complex that it requires separate texts. We can understand this complicated subject in simple terms by realizing that a living entity feels inferior, then decides to become superior by its own power, struggles to establish superiority but ultimately fails in that attempt and returns back to the state of inferiority. The Shakta, Vaishnava, and Shaiva texts are not saying contradictory things. They are talking about the different stages of a very complex process. If the big picture of the material struggle is understood, then we can better understand the details within each of these descriptions.